Most people believe they're afraid of failure. They say it holds them back, that it makes them hesitate, that it's the reason they don't take risks or fully commit. But failure isn't what stops most people. Freedom is. Freedom removes structure. It removes excuses. It removes the familiar edges that tell you who you are and what's expected of you. And for a nervous system that has learned to survive inside limitation, that absence can feel deeply unsettling. Failure, at least, is familiar. Failure fits inside known rules. You can explain it. You can justify it. You can tell yourself you tried, or that the timing wasn't right, or that the circumstances weren't ideal. Failure gives you a reason to stay where you are without having to question your identity. Freedom does not. Freedom asks a different question. If nothing is stopping you, who do you become? That question doesn't feel exciting to most people. It feels exposing. Freedom removes the external pressures that once guided your choices. There's no authority to rebel against, no limitation to blame, no obstacle to point to as the reason you haven't moved forward yet. And without those constraints, responsibility shifts inward. That's where discomfort begins. When people get close to real freedom, they often feel disoriented rather than empowered. There's a loss of orientation that comes with not being told what to do, who to be, or how far you're allowed to go. The familiar tension of striving disappears, and in its place is space, too much space. For a nervous system accustomed to operating under pressure, space can feel unsafe. Pressure creates direction. Limitation creates identity. Struggle provides a story. Freedom removes all three. This is why people will unconsciously choose situations that restrict them. They stay in roles that limit their expression. They keep goals small. They accept rules they've already outgrown. Not because they enjoy being confined, but because confinement provides a sense of psychological safety. Failure fits inside that confinement. Freedom dismantles it. With freedom, there's no longer a clear script to follow. You can't rely on old patterns to guide you. You have to listen inwardly. You have to decide based on truth instead of necessity. And that requires a level of self-trust most people haven't been taught to develop. So instead of moving toward freedom, they move toward effort. Effort feels safer. Effort feels familiar. Effort feels earned. You can stay busy. You can stay improving. You can stay chasing the next milestone, all while avoiding the deeper question freedom asks. What would you choose if nothing was holding you back? This is why people often sabotage themselves right when options open up, right when constraints lift, right when success becomes possible. The nervous system senses unfamiliar territory and pulls back, not out of fear of failure, but out of fear of the unknown self that freedom would require them to become. Freedom doesn't threaten your success, it threatens your identity. And until that is understood, failure will continue to take the blame for something it never caused. Freedom doesn't feel dangerous because of what it might take from you. It feels dangerous because of what it demands from you. When external limits fall away, the nervous system loses the structure it relied on to make decisions. Rules, expectations, and constraints quietly act as scaffolding. They tell you how much effort is required, how far you're allowed to go, and what success is supposed to look like. Freedom removes that scaffolding. Suddenly, there's no clear boundary telling you when you've done enough. No external pressure defining what matters most. And without those signals, your system has to generate direction internally. For many people, that's unfamiliar territory. They've learned how to respond, not how to choose. So when freedom appears, the system looks for replacement constraints. It seeks something that will recreate the familiar tension of limitation. Deadlines, obligations, pressure, even self-criticism. These things don't feel good, but they feel known. Failure fits neatly inside that structure. It gives shape to effort. You can measure yourself against expectations. You can tell yourself you'll try again later. You can preserve the version of yourself that's always almost there. Freedom removes the almost. It asks you to step fully into authorship. That's where resistance forms. When people say they're afraid of failing, what they're often afraid of is having no one else to blame, no system to push against, no excuse to hide behind. Freedom collapses the distance between choice and consequence. You choose and you live with it. That level of responsibility feels heavy to a nervous system that learns safety through compliance or performance. If you were rewarded for meeting expectations rather than trusting yourself, freedom feels like standing without armor. So the system does what it knows how to do. It delays. It overthinks. It complicates simple decisions. You might notice this when options are open but nothing feels clear. Instead of excitement, there's a sense of paralysis. You search for certainty before moving. You wait for permission that never arrives. This isn't indecision. It's a nervous system trying to recreate familiar limits. Freedom feels unstructured, and unstructured space makes old fears louder. Doubt rises. Self-judgment intensifies. The mind starts scanning for the right choice, not because it exists, but because choosing without guarantees feels unsafe. So people unconsciously shrink freedom back into something manageable. They add rules. They delay action. They lower the stakes. They turn freedom into another version of effort because effort feels safer than openness. This is why people will work endlessly toward goals, but hesitate once those goals are within reach. Striving gives them identity. Freedom requires self-trust, and self-trust can't be borrowed from external systems. It has to be built internally. Until that happens, freedom will continue to feel like exposure rather than expansion, and failure will keep being blamed for a fear that actually belongs to responsibility, authorship, and the unfamiliar experience of choosing without constraint. When freedom begins to feel real, the nervous system often reacts before the mind can explain why. This is where people get confused. They think they're overthinking. They think they've lost motivation. They think something is wrong with their confidence. But what's actually happening is much simpler. Freedom removes the familiar stress signals your nervous system learned to rely on. For a long time, pressure created orientation. Deadlines told you what mattered. Expectations told you how to behave. Struggle gave you a sense of forward motion. Even anxiety had a purpose. It kept you moving. When those signals disappear, the system doesn't automatically relax. It becomes alert, because alertness was once necessary to survive uncertainty. You might notice this when things finally slow down or open up. Instead of relief, there's restlessness. Instead of clarity, there's agitation. Your body stays tense even though there's nothing demanding your attention. Your thoughts race, searching for something to solve. This isn't because freedom is dangerous. It's because your nervous system hasn't learned how to feel safe without tension. For many people, stress became the background noise of life. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. It created a sense of momentum, and momentum felt like progress. Freedom interrupts that rhythm. Without pressure, there's no urgency. Without urgency, there's no clear direction. And without direction, the nervous system feels unanchored. So it tries to recreate what it knows. You may unconsciously create problems. You may take on unnecessary responsibilities. You may set rigid rules for yourself, or move the goalposts just as you're about to reach them. Not because you enjoy stress, but because stress provides structure. This is how freedom quietly turns into discomfort. The body doesn't know what to do with openness. There's too much space, too many choices. too much responsibility for deciding what matters. And choice without internal trust feels like risk. This is why people often feel calmer when they're struggling than when they're free. Struggle narrows the field. It tells you where to focus. Freedom expands it, and expansion requires a nervous system that can tolerate uncertainty without panicking. Most people were never taught that skill. They were taught how to perform, how to comply, how to push through. They were not taught how to orient themselves internally. So when freedom arrives, the system searches for an external anchor, a rule, a demand, a reason to stay small. Failure becomes comforting in that context. Failure restores familiarity. It puts you back inside known limits. It gives you a story that makes sense. Freedom offers no such narrative. It asks you to write one yourself. That's a heavier load than most people realize. Until the nervous system learns that openness doesn't require constant vigilance, freedom will feel destabilizing. The body will brace, the mind will hesitate, and progress will stall. Not because of fear of failing, but because of fear of standing in unstructured space without armor. Freedom requires a regulated system, not a motivated one, not a disciplined one, a regulated one. And without that regulation, the system will always pull you back toward what feels known, even if what's known no longer fits who you're becoming. This is where fear of freedom starts showing up in ways people don't immediately recognize. It doesn't look like panic. It doesn't look like doubt. It looks like self-sabotage at the exact moment things begin to open up. Opportunities appear. Constraints loosen. You finally have room to choose differently. And instead of moving forward, something inside you hesitates. You lose momentum. You start questioning decisions you were previously confident about. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the nervous system's perspective, it makes perfect sense. Freedom represents a loss of containment. When structure disappears, the system has to regulate itself instead of relying on external pressure to do it. And if that internal regulation hasn't been developed, the body experiences freedom as exposure, exposure to choice, exposure to responsibility, exposure to uncertainty. So the system intervenes. It creates friction right when movement would require trust. You may procrastinate. You may suddenly feel exhausted. You may convince yourself that now isn't the right time, even though nothing external has changed. This is not laziness. It's a protective reflex. The nervous system is trying to return you to a state it knows how to manage. And since freedom feels unfamiliar, it looks for ways to shrink the field of possibility back down to something predictable. Failure does that efficiently. Failure reintroduces limits. It gives you a clear explanation for stopping. It removes the need to decide what comes next. You can regroup. You can replan. You can stay inside preparation instead of authorship. This is why people often repeat cycles. They work toward change. They get close. They pull back. Not because they don't want success, but because success without structure forces them to confront who they are without struggle defining them. Struggle gives identity. It tells you you're trying. It tells you you're resilient. It tells you you're becoming something. Freedom removes the narrative of becoming and asks you to be. And being without constant effort feels unfamiliar to systems trained in survival through striving. So people unconsciously recreate struggle. They complicate simple paths. They add unnecessary steps. They stay busy with improvement instead of stepping into expression. This keeps them safe, but it also keeps them stuck. The cost isn't just delayed success, it's delayed self-trust. Because every time you pull back from freedom, you reinforce the belief that you can't handle openness, that you need pressure to function, that without limits you lose direction or collapse. Those beliefs don't come from truth. They come from conditioning, and conditioning can be rewritten, but only when it's seen clearly. Until then, freedom will continue to feel like a cliff instead of a field, and failure will continue to feel like a soft landing, even though it keeps you inside the same familiar edges. Understanding this pattern isn't about pushing harder. It's about recognizing that the hesitation you feel near freedom isn't a warning sign. It's a threshold, and thresholds always feel unstable right before they become normal. When freedom finally begins to feel possible, the work is no longer about pushing forward. It's about staying present. Most people think freedom arrives as a burst of confidence or clarity. They expect it to feel empowering, decisive, and energizing. But real freedom often arrives quietly, and when it does, it asks something very specific of your nervous system. It asks you to remain grounded without pressure. For someone who learned to function through effort, struggle, or constraint, this can feel deeply unfamiliar. You're no longer reacting to circumstances. You're no longer defined by what you're overcoming. You're choosing from openness instead of necessity. That's a very different state. Freedom doesn't tell you who to be. It doesn't tell you what to do next. It doesn't provide urgency or structure. It provides space. And space requires self-trust. This is where many people instinctively reach for something to fill that space. Another goal, another challenge, another problem to solve. Not because those things are wrong, but because they restore a familiar rhythm of striving. But freedom isn't meant to be filled immediately. It's meant to be stabilized. Stabilizing freedom means allowing your nervous system to learn that nothing bad happens when you're not being pushed, that your sense of self doesn't disappear when effort softens, that you can remain oriented without pressure telling you where to go. This learning doesn't happen through thought. It happens through experience. Each time you choose not to retreat into struggle, each time you resist creating unnecessary tension, each time you stay with openness instead of rushing to close it, your system updates. It learns that freedom doesn't equal danger, that choice doesn't require panic, that responsibility doesn't mean isolation. Over time, freedom stops feeling like exposure and starts feeling like capacity. From that place, action changes. You no longer move to escape discomfort. You move because something feels true. You choose because you trust yourself to respond if things change. This is the difference between driven progress and embodied movement. Driven progress needs obstacles to function. Embodied movement doesn't. Failure once felt safer because it preserved identity. It allowed you to stay in becoming instead of being. Freedom removes that buffer, but it also removes the need to prove yourself through struggle. When freedom becomes regulated, effort becomes cleaner. You can work deeply without being consumed. You can rest without guilt. You can decide without needing certainty. This is not about abandoning ambition. It's about maturing it. Ambition no longer needs fear to fuel it. It no longer needs limitation to define it. It can exist alongside openness, curiosity, and choice. And when that happens, freedom stops being something you avoid or fear. It becomes something you inhabit. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but steadily, as your nervous system learns that being uncontained doesn't mean being unsafe. It means being responsible for your life in a way that finally feels aligned.